Thank you so very much. Indeed, blessed to be here. I'd first like to thank my dear friend and brother, Professor Dwight Hopkins, for those very kind and generous remarks. I would like to congratulate him on his vision and determination in bringing us together, not so much for this particular lecture, but to give honor and tribute to the distinguished theologian, my friend and comrade and colleague, James Howell Cone. Let us have Professor Cone please stand up. Where is Professor Cone? Here he is. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Indeed, indeed. Very much so. Very much so. Thank my friend and brother Dean Clark Gilpin as well, of course. But I think it's going to take another generation or two to fully understand and grasp the profound intellectual, political, and existential contribution of Professor James Howell Cone. And I intend this evening to reflect a bit on this classic of 1969, Black Theology and Black Power, still in print. I want to publicly thank Professor Cone, who is not only my friend and colleague, but my co-teacher at Union Theological Seminary for the 8 wonderful years that I was there at beloved Union Theological Seminary in the Upper West Side of the Big Apple. I'd like to publicly thank him for not only his support, but for writing this text that was so pivotal in the life of a young 14-year-old black brother in Sacramento, California. I shall never forget, in fact, I still have the exact copy. I don't like to buy the new editions, as it were. I have my writings and reflections on the older copies. I still have this particular copy because it is so precious. It changed the lives of thousands and thousands and thousands of young brothers and sisters of all colors who were wrestling with what does it mean to be Christian in a turbulent time in which the vicious legacy of white supremacy was being contested, pushed back, as it were. And for me, this particular text in the history of American civilization raises the most fundamental question of what it means to be human. When he raised the question of how do we relate our Christian faith to the challenge of the Black Power movement, he was raising a question that each and every American, each and every human being has to come to terms with, namely, how do we conceive of ourselves as the featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces that we are, who are in search for a little meaning and a little care and a little love in the face of unavoidable and inescapable extinction of some sort. Very much like one of the first towering texts of modernity to wrestle with the question of what it means to believe, what it means to be human in the face of death. I'm thinking of Voltaire's Candide, 1759, responding to the thousands of corpses on All Saints' Day, November 1, 1755, in the city of Lisbon, that would fracture and shatter any optimistic conception of there being somehow a providence that could serve as a basis of explaining those corpses, especially as we know at that particular time, the corpses in the churches, the brothels were spared. in that second earthquake of December 21, 1755, that would shake the foundations not just of Lisbon, but of any thin and impoverished and truncated Enlightenment conceptions of progress. No, we've got to look the terrors of nature in the face. We've got to look the horrors of history in the face. We've got to look the cruelties of fate and the furies of destiny in the face, and still somehow find a way of going through and keeping on. Voltaire wrestling with death as a particular event, but also as process. The death of any optimism in his own philosophical project. Professor Cohn in Black Theology and Black Power, as I shall attempt to show, wrestling with death, existential crises, relates to his own particular life of what it means to be a particular black man from Arkansas, then at Adrian College, and wrestling with the death of Martin 30 years ago tomorrow. But before we move to Cohn, let us move to the second moment in modernity, just to serve as some kind of historical backdrop and context. And I'm thinking of none other than the work of the great Schelling of 1809. Philosophical investigations on the essence of human freedom. Probably the grandest text of the 19th century in Europe that fundamentally confronts the palpability and reality of evil, that shatters any German idealistic system that thinks that somehow all they need do is probe into the internal dynamics of consciousness and thereby conclude that the rationality of the world can be shown and displayed. But Schelling, it's over, as the great Heidegger says in his Freiburg lectures of the summer of 1934, that Schelling had shattered Hegel's logic before it was written. Why? Because of the reality of evil, the ineradicability of the non-rational, the intractability of the unfathomable, the recalcitrance of reality, maybe even the accursedness of being, as he writes in that frightening and poetic text. And I'm sure some of you recall those powerful and poignant moments in Shelley's text where he says, maybe in fact, the unruly that sits at the very center of the origins of things, the difference between existence and the ground of existence is such that a veil of sadness pervades all nature, a deep, unappeasable melancholy, a shot through all of life. He was to live 45 more years and not publish another major text. It's a small pamphlet attacking Jacobi. But he responding to the death of his wife, Carolyn, overwhelmed by a particular event and process that would push him to the edge of life's abyss. Black Theology and Black Power, looking at the corpses of young black folk in Newark of 1967 and Detroit of 1967, the 329 uprisings in 257 cities between 1964 and 1969. The young James Howell Cone says, I'm overwhelmed by this. What do I have to say? I either write this book or I'll go crazy. That's the kind of theology I like. Outcry. Like Aretha singing her song, she either sings it or the rocks are gonna cry out. We need more intellectual work like this that comes from the heart and the soul and mind as well. And the Academy doesn't know what to do with it. But one more moment before we move to Professor Cohn's work, and that, of course, is 1879, The Grand Inquisitor, written by the great Fyodor Dostoevsky, in the face of the death of his young 3-year-old son, Alexei. In that book 5, chapter 5, in the prose poem, probably the high moment of wrestling with the reality of evil in European literature. Ways in which elites dangle miracle and mystery and authority in the face of the masses in order to pacify them, assuming that they do not have the capacity to actually bear the burden and responsibility of freedom, as terrifying and horrifying as freedom actually is. That very, very indescribable moment, the Inquisitor waiting for an answer from Jesus. Jesus approaches in silence and softly kisses the bloodless and aged lips of the Grand Inquisitor, the old man who manipulates, who represents the institutions that believe that we do not have the courage and vision to actually take on freedom, the capacity to choose between good and evil. And what does that old man do? What does the Grand Inquisitor do? Like Faust in the realm of the mothers, he shudders. The cosmic shudder, the existential quiver, the tragic qualm, ontological vertigo in the face of what seems to be an inexplicable reality of such darkness, the night side, the underside. Yes, James H. Cohn, speaking to America and saying, I know that you are an exemplary death-dodging and death-ducking culture, sentimental and melodramatic, coming up with ingenious modes of denying and evading and avoiding the underside of things, but there's some suffering here, there's some sadness and sorrow and heartache and heartbreak, there is some grief here, there is some doings and some actions here with which you must come to terms, because 1968 has reached the point now where the foundations of American civilization have begun to shake. 212 uprisings the night that the bullets go through the precious body of Martin Luther King Jr. America can no longer deny the fact that either they come to terms with the vicious legacy of white supremacy, or the curtain will fall on the precious experiment in democracy called America, just like the Civil War 100 years earlier. And James Cone writes, and I want you to listen to his words clearly. He says, this work is written with a definite attitude. The attitude of an angry black man disgusted with the oppression of black people in America and with the scholarly demand to be objective about it. Too many people have died, and too many are on the edge of death. Is it not time for theologians to get upset? What does it take to unsettle some of these paradigms that generate these fascinating and subtle formulations about God and society, and yet there's people dying in your very midst and you don't have a word to say about it? 1969, Professor Cohn is saying. Now, 30 years later, of course, the academy's come a little further. I will recognize that here at the University of Chicago. I know you still got a long way to go, but I recognize that, partly because of Professor James Cone. There's no doubt about it. But in this text, Mr. James Cone is dealing with not just the death of Martin, not just the death of so many freedom fighters of all colors, though disproportionately black. But he's also dealing with the death of something in him. It's the death of the Negro and the birth of blackness. It's the death of a certain kind of deferential disposition to white supremacy in the hearts and minds and souls of black people themselves, and the birth of a certain kind of self-assertiveness, a courage to be. There's a fascinating section called Black Power and Existential Absurdity. It's one of my favorite treatments, rarely talked about in this text. And the first reference is actually from a book edited by one of the distinguished professors years ago of this grand institution, my good friend, Professor Nathan Scott. Professor Cone alludes to an essay entitled Beckett's Last Long Saturday. Not Good Friday and not Easter, but Saturday. When God, even for Christians, is dead. I'm not talking about any post-resurrection Christ. I'm talking about the Jesus who is dead. And Easter not yet here. And the waiting for Godot. The waiting for God, and how black folk have been locked into this rock and a hard place. This night-like Saturday, like Beckett's clowns of Dee and Go and waiting for Godot. Lorraine Hansberry, Chicago's own Lorraine Hansberry, towering figure that she was, she wrote a fascinating parody of Waiting for Godot called The Arrival of Toe Dog. Godot spelled backwards. And a black humanist responds to that waiting. That being the leftist intellectual that she was, she didn't want to linger too long with despair and absurdity. Professor Cone begins his book saying, to wrestle with what it means to be black is to wrestle with what it means to be human, and to wrestle with what it means to be human is looking at the ways in which an affirmation of life is a facing of death. He goes on to say, let me allow him to speak for himself because his language is so powerful. Black power is hope in the humanity of black people, he says. And for Professor Cone, that particular affirmation of black humanity is predicated on the death in black folk of a certain conception of themselves. What I find so fascinating about this particular text is that it's not interdisciplinary, it's de-disciplinizing. That it's a frenetic text, it's a frantic text, which means that it's thoroughly unconcerned about what particular discipline it fits in or how it connects one discipline from another. It's simply trying to get out from the bowels of his existence some conception of what it means to be human, such that the death that he's wrestling with does not have the last word. He puts it so well here. He says, this is a word to the oppressor, not in hope that he will listen, After King's death, who can hope? But in the expectation that my own existence will be clarified. That's powerful to me. Existential crises, self-examination, self-interrogation, self-clarification, most importantly, self-justification. And I believe that it's a question that all of us ought to ask a number of times in our lives, including young people today. Just questioning oneself in terms of what one is doing. Not just examining oneself in terms of trying to connect one's own profession or vocation to a cause, a set of principles bigger than you. But one's self-justification. Why is one doing what one is doing in the face of such unjustified suffering and unnecessary social misery and unmerited pain in the world? How do you respond to that question? You see Professor Cone teaching at Adrian College in 1968, looking around about him in America and saying, why am I doing what I'm doing? I tell people I'm a systematic theologian. And they said, well, what the hell does that have to do with these people out here being shot down like dogs? And in his vision and in his courage, he says, I can find some intellectual resources, though fragmented that they may be, that allows me to still respond to the call of being a theologian and a Christian in the face of what seems to be so overwhelming. Now, granted, he recognizes that his education had been problematic and therefore had not provided him with as much support as he would like. I should read this just for the seminarians here. He says, the one explanation that most American theologians are too closely tied through the American structure to respond creatively to this situation holds true. Instead of seeking to respond to the problems which are unique to this country, most Americans look to Europe for the newest word worth theologizing about. Most graduate students in theology feel they must go to Germany or somewhere else in Europe because that is where things are happening in the area of theology. Little wonder that American theology is predominantly footnotes on the Germans, as he said. This is 1969. He said, theology here in America is largely an intellectual game unrelated to the issues of life and death. It's impossible to respond creatively and prophetically to the life situational problems of society without identifying with the problems of the disinherited and unwanted in society. Few American theologians have made that identification with poor blacks in America, but have themselves contributed to the system which enslaves black people. The seminaries in America are probably the most obvious sign of the irrelevance of theology to life. Their initiation in responding to the crisis of black people in America is virtually unnoticeable. Circa 1969. But his training was such that though he learned much, Bart, Bruner, and the two grand Niebuhr brothers, H. Richard and Reinhold, they still had not wrestled in any serious and sophisticated and substantive way with the multidimensional character of the legacy of white supremacy. Hence, Professor Cone oftentimes felt himself at that young age disarmed, having to do his own intellectual work, his own reading, his own dialogues with others. Now granted, again, things have changed, but we shall talk about how much. There's no doubt that the impact of Professor Cone's work and a whole host of other intellectuals of all colors which focus on the doing and sufferings not just of people of African descent, but the vast majority of humankind, of women of all colors, sisters of all colors, working peoples, Africans, Asians, Arabs, Jews, all those who have been viewed as degraded others. Things have changed in 30 years, and yet we still have so far to go, hence still the relevance of this text. Now, at that particular time, of course, there was a fascinating dialogue going on about the death of God. The so-called theothanatologists. And Professor Cone has some fascinating formulations about that particular school of thought, because of course it is a very serious school of thought. There's no doubt about that. One must take quite seriously Nietzsche's grand claim of the death of God in section 125 of The Gay Science, or Thomas Harding's grand poem of 1912, God's Funeral, and the ways in which this forces us to rethink our conception of ourselves. But Professor Cone goes much further here. He says, there's something ironic about affirming God's death in view of one's identity with a cultural structure which enslaves. If the affirmation of God's death grows out of one's identity with suffering, then it's understandable, perhaps necessary. But if it arises out of one's identity with an advancing technological secular society which ignores the reality of God and the humanity of man, then it appears to be the height of human pride. This is the most disturbing fact in relation to recent developments in American white theology. Professor Cone is raising, I think, a fundamental question that has been raised throughout the black freedom struggle. Namely, whether there actually are enough intellectual, political, cultural, and political resources in American life to fully undermine the vicious legacy of white supremacy in America. I discern and detect in this text a death of the promise or faith in the promise of American democracy. I think this particular sensibility is one that millions of people of African descent experienced after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. It's the question of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. It's the question of Marcus Garvey. It's the question of Minister Louis Farrakhan. What makes us think that America has the capacity to produce a full-fledged multiracial democracy in which people of African descent are treated as kindly and equally as anybody else in every sphere of our lives? What evidence do we have historically? 244 years of enslavement, 71 years of Jim Crow, 51 years of every 2.5 days some black child, a black woman, a black man hanging on some tree that strange fruit the southern trees bear that Billie Holiday sang about. What makes us think that just within these last 25 and 30 years, where we have made significant progress and breakthrough, that it cuts deep enough such that these white supremacist sensibilities, be they subtle or not too subtly expressed, will not come back in the way in which it did after the first Reconstruction? What evidence do we have? Professor Cone writes, he says, whether the American system is beyond redemption, we will have to wait and see. But we can be certain that black patience has run out. And unless white America responds positively to the theory and activity of black power, then a bloody, protracted civil war is inevitable. There have occasionally been revolutions, massive redistributions of power without warfare. It is passionately to be hoped, he says, that this can be one of them. The decision lies with white America, and not least with white Americans who speak the name of Christ. And when we look back now in 30 years, we hear from our dear and blessed conservative and neoconservative friends and brothers and sisters, Brother West, why not start with all the great progress? We've got a middle class now, a black middle class, or what E. Franklin Frazier called a black lumpen bourgeoisie, a middle class beneath the American middle class with less wealth. And it's true that progress is real. Our dear friend, the great Garrett Wilmore, spoke yesterday. It was a historic moment to see him there, reflecting on Professor James Cone's work. I can see them now in their living room working on Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Black Theology, a documentary history. And he said, is it the case that the legacy of black theology is one that resides in the academy but has not been able to spill over in such a way that it affects our churches, our brothers and sisters on the ground, on the corner, in the streets, in the beauty salons and barbershops? And there's nothing wrong with black folk being in the academy. You know, most of these academies did not have black folk in mind when they were founded, and didn't celebrate when they made their entree. But owing to democratic forces, citizens of all colors began to open up, not just because they were psychologically sensitive, but because they recognized that there were institutions of higher learning involved in a quest for truth, small t, and knowledge, small k, and you can't be involved in a quest for truth and knowledge without coming to terms with the weight of an evil like white supremacy, or the humanity of a slice of our human family like people of African descent. So it was just being true to the mission of the institution of higher learning that these folk were brought in. Back to the question. 30 years now after Martin's death and the progress that has been made, we must not deny. But Malcolm X reminds us, you don't stab a man in the back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches and say you're making progress. Got a long way to go. Professor Cone's text that begins with death is calling for us to die daily. Reminds me a bit of what Minister Louis Farrakhan said at the Million Man March. The New York Times and Washington Post didn't pick this up, but he said, white supremacy must die in order for America to truly live. Most Americans aren't used to agreeing with Minister Louis Farrakhan, so they held off on that line. But I think all of us would agree it has got to die. We could add, male supremacy must die, anti-Arab racism must die, anti-Semitism must die, vast economic inequality must die, homophobia must die, ecological abuse must die. But again, it's a process, not an event. And it dies in part when we look deep, deep down within our hearts and souls and minds and recognize that the white supremacy and male supremacy and homophobia is in me, as well as in our institutions. Listen to how Professor Cone ends his text. He says, to be black means that your heart, your soul, and your mind and your body are where the dispossessed are. We all know that a racist structure will reject and threaten a black man in white skin as quickly as a black man in black skin. It accepts and rewards whites in black skins nearly as well as whites in white skin. Now he's moving here. He's getting symbolic, it's getting metaphorical here. Therefore, being reconciled to God does not mean that one's skin is physically black. It essentially depends on the color of your heart, soul, and mind. Some may want to argue that persons with skins physically black will have a running start on others, but there seems to be enough evidence that though one's skin is black, the heart may be lily white. The real questions are, where is your identity? Where is your being? What kind of person are you really? What forms of integrity and character are exemplified in your deeds and in your work? Does it lie with the oppressed blacks or with the white oppressor? Let us hope that there are enough to answer this question correctly so that America will not be compelled to acknowledge a common humanity only by seeing that blood is always one color. Powerful ending to this text that goes far beyond simply polemic and Jeremiad. The notion of wrestling with what it means to be human through dealing with corpses, reminded, of course, of the Latin term humando, burying. We human beings tend to be those persons who bury our dead and therefore ascribe a meaning to their lives lived in light of our lives to be lived, and connecting then present to past to project the future. You see? Where then do we go? I want to end by acknowledging what I discern to be a blues sensibility in Professor Cone's text. Yesterday, Professor Wilmore suggested that Black Theology and Black Power, the first text, published in 1969, immediately followed by the Black Theology of Liberation, or companion text. And I can see his point. It's a plausible point. But I would want to read this particular text of Professor Cone over against his 1972 text entitled The Spirituals and the Blues. Because what I see Professor Cone attempting to do is to inject a tragic sensibility into American theological discourse that focuses on the sufferings of people of African descent, but tries to get us to see the various ways in which heroic energy can be enacted over against limits, constraints, anange, as it were. And that tragic sensibility will force us to shatter any sentimental or melodramatic conceptions of an American past or present. It will force what Henry James called this hotel civilization to recognize that the lights can go off. They're not on all the time. That sunshine is unintelligible without the night. And that in 1968, with the death of Martin Luther King Jr., slices of black humanity on streets responding to police with rifles cocked, that darkness is now coming back to haunt an America in denial about its white supremacist legacy. Where are we today? Do we have a deep enough sense of history with a tragic sensibility? Do we have enough compassion out there that builds on this sense of history with a tragic sensibility? Do we have enough courage and vision to confront our mortality so that we're willing to live and die for something bigger than us, like the children with tears in their eyes? And I end with one example. We were told back in January by President Bill Clinton that it's good times for America. In light of what Professor Cone has said, he would respond, good times for who? a moment of triumphalism with new idols like markets and privatizing forces, with new forms of mendacity like using stock market records and budget balance as benchmarks of good times rather than quality of lives lived. Depth of spirituality to keeping on in the midst of not just material impoverishment, but even for brothers and sisters disproportionately white in disproportionately vanilla suburbs, still having to deal with existential emptiness and spiritual malnutrition because they have not received enough care and nurture and love along with all of their money and prosperity. What kind of good times can this be when suicide rates are increasing among young people? 21% of all of our children live in poverty, and 52% of young brown brothers and sisters live in poverty, and 51% of black children live in utter poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. And we here talk about good times. Listen to the prophetic voice of Professor Cone 30 years ago. I suggest he would say to his fellow citizens, Bill Clinton. 1% of the population owning 39% of the wealth. 80% of fellow citizens wrestling with long-term tendencies of wage stagnation since 1973, just recently upturned in 2 months. What good times do you have in mind? De facto segregation in American life, no longer legalized, but still more radically segregated today in terms of where we live, who we socialize with, the churches and mosques and synagogues we go to. Have we come a long way? Indeed, yes. And yet the same sugar-coated language that accents the superfluities and superficialities of our day must be pierced to deal with the harsh realities. It's not just globalization as the context, but it's a globalization with choices being made like managerial greed at the workplace, so that downsizing goes hand in hand with not only higher profits, but higher salaries and benefits for management. That's not a natural process. That's political choices and priorities being put forward. Let us listen to Professor Cone's prophetic voice that links these issues of race to those of class and gender. And it's not PC chit-chat. It has everything to do with the future of American democracy. It has everything to do with the calling of a particular kind of thinker, a thinker who loves enough to attempt to tell the truth about himself as he tells the truth about others. Professor Cone ends on a note of hope. But in the best of the black freedom struggle tradition, it is a blood-drenched hope. No sunshine optimism, but a blood-drenched hope. We look in prisons today, dilapidated housing, decrepit school systems in cities, not enough jobs with a living wage, inadequate health care, unavailable child care, blood-drenched hope. And yet, he opens his arms and says, whosoever will, let him or her come, if one is willing to be metaphorically blackenized. Which has nothing to do solely with skin pigmentation, but very much like Keats's conception of identity. He asks us to dip our intelligence into the world of pain and trouble in order to emerge with a response to the fundamental query of energy or despair, courage or complacency, love or night. Professor Cohn says quite explicitly, it's all about energy. It's all about courage. In the end, it's all about love and justice. And I thank you, Professor Cohn, and we thank you, Professor Cohn, for your work that you've done, the life that you've lived, and the example that you have set for young brothers and sisters of all colors like myself, trying to wrestle with how one intellectually, existentially, and politically responds to unjustified suffering as we are trapped in space and time, and yet at the same time we have the wonderful gift of grace that allows us to attempt to be free in our hearts and minds and souls, to engage in the truth-telling and soul-searching and witness-bearing that represents the highest heights of the human spirit. And he, like me, remains part of the Christian tradition in all of our audacity and all of our humility. Why? Because we're still convinced that Jesus of Nazareth has something to do with that courage to be, and the courage to love, and the courage to fight for justice in the midst of such intolerable and overwhelming circumstances and conditions. Now, what precisely Jesus has to do, I have no answer. I am no theologian. Read his other texts along with others. Thank you so very much.
Wish to pose a question to Professor West, we have a microphone in the center aisle there. Please feel free to come forward, and those who wish, please form a line.
Please don't hesitate. Any questions, queries, comments, and so forth? Yes, go right ahead.
What can you tell us of your views of the spirituality of Malcolm X?
Appreciate that question. It's a deep one. The question was, what can I say about the spirituality of Malcolm X? Of course, let me first add that Professor Cohn has written a fascinating and powerful text on Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, so I could highly recommend that book. But first, we have to define what we mean by spirituality. I think for me there's two dominant forms of spirituality. There's what the great Josiah Royce called the spirituality of genuine questioning, which is the examined life linked to an acknowledgement of the ways in which we humans suffer, shudder, and struggle. And so it's an intellectual form, but it's an intellectual form that is always existentially grounded in reflection on lived experience, a spirituality of genuine doubting and questioning and seeking. Then there's a spirituality of giving, Spirituality enacted in loving and being compassionate and so forth. I mean, one way of talking about this is trying to bring together Socrates and Jesus, right? One who argues, interrogates, questions, but it's unclear that Socrates ever cries. Xenophon, Plato, Aristophanes are three sources of Socrates, since he, like Jesus, never wrote a word. We have to depend on these sources. But there's no doubt that there's a deep form of spirituality in the form of seeking and doubting and questioning. Then you got Jesus, who weeps because he loves so deeply, in part, you see. And it's a giving, right? It's empathy, it's a compassion in that sense. And to be able to talk about spirituality with both wings affirmed, I think is so very, very important. I mean, I've talked before in my earlier work about how John Coltrane's A Love Supreme was an attempt to bring these two various forms of spirituality together, you see, so that it is a self-invested, almost crypto-Kierkegaardian form of questioning, which has to do with wrestling with the eternal, brooding within one's own soul, but also linked to works of love in the Love Supreme. How does this relate to Malcolm X? Well, Malcolm X, of course, was always involved in seeking and doubting and questioning. The benchmark of maturity is an acknowledgement of one's own need to not just grow, but to painfully proceed, you see. And of course, he continued to grow all of his very short life of 39 years. In terms of spirituality of giving, is no doubt that Malcolm X, very much like Mr. Elijah Muhammad, had a profound love of black people, deep love ethic. Early on, it took an immature virgin. It was a love of black people predicated on putting whites down, which was a sign of not simply moral immaturity, but also a sign he was still obsessed with whiteness, because to put whiteness on a pedestal or to put it in the gutter is still a sign of being obsessed with it, and therefore you are not free from whiteness. And you're only free from the whiteness when you see them as other human brothers and sisters who also have same kinds of problems, anxieties, fears, insecurities, jealousies, envies like anybody else. They just happen to have certain kind of white skin privilege in a white supremacist world. And that can be changed, you see. And Malcolm X, early on, had this deep love of black folk, but he was locked into an immature version that put whites down, and he began to grow out of that. So that his love for black people became a love for oppressed people, became a love for humanity as a whole, never losing sight of white supremacy, but also no longer being locked into a discourse of whiteness in which he had to put whites in the gutter in order to lift himself up. That's spiritual growth on both fronts. That's the beginning of an answer, though. You know, it takes a long time. Malcolm X, such a complex brother. That's just the beginning of an answer to the question, though. Mm-hmm.
I appreciate a lot of things you said. I grew up in the south side of Chicago, and I went to an Ivy League school and came here for graduate school. But I became a Christian about 4 years ago, and I had to repent of several things. Two of the things I had to repent of was my pride and my racism. Even though I had, white friends who were like me and Asian friends who were like me, I had to just flat out repent of just my racism. And my question really is, why do we have to rely on the intellectuals or the government or anyone else? Why can't we just rely on the power of God and through our repentance, the disciples throughout the world, looking at everyone, the Bible says, love even your enemies, just looking at everyone and loving them. And where do we have to rely on intellectuals or governments for that?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right that you never want to rely on intellectuals or government in order to convince yourself that you should love somebody. And you're definitely right about that, though, brother. We all want to take that lesson home, you know what I mean? Very much so. But of course, we've got a number of different levels of our discourse here. There's an ethic that has to do with our interpersonal relations with others, of just treating people right because that's the right thing to do. That's a way of being in the world. That's in part what love is about. But then there's another discourse that has to do with institutions. And institutions are much more complex entities in which a discourse of love is never fully adequate. We can bring in justice, democracy, social freedom, and so forth and so on. You got a whole different kind of cluster of notions to be applied to that level of discourse. So when it comes to interpersonal discourse, which is the discourse that you are accenting, love, compassion, treating people right, and so forth, which is always a perennial process. You're never going to do it perfectly, so don't be disappointed when you fall on your face sometime. But you continue the quest to do that. But you can never collapse the second discourse into the first, you see. There always has to be a way of talking about institutions and structures that are not reducible to the personal and the interpersonal. And you know Reinhold Niebuhr's great text, The Moral Man and the Immoral Society of 1932, adds a fascinating starting point in wrestling with that issue. So that for me is the first thing I would say about your question.
I have one quick second question.
Sure.
Part of my repentance was, of course, making friends of all backgrounds, but also making sure that I was going and worshiping God in a church where there was, it was interracial church, all backgrounds. What do you think the role is of the so-called, we hear it all the time, black church or even white church today? Is there really a role for the black church when our goal should be to love everyone and make disciples of all nations?
Yeah, well, of course, one is that one role of the church is to be humble enough to recognize that in attempting to preach and proclaim the gospel, that it always stands in the need of self-criticism and scrutiny. So that it never ever has a monopoly on the sole true dogma or doctrine. That there's always a relative failure of human intelligence, human rationality, as important as human intelligence and rationality actually are. There's always a relative failure, falling short. And therefore the attempt to get our churches not simply to be less dogmatic, but to be courageous enough to acknowledge that they could be wrong. They could be wrong. And yet allow the depths of the gospel with all of its preoccupation with love and compassion to be available and to flow from pew to pew and person to person and block to block and neighborhood to neighborhood and country to country, you see. But that's the beginning of a discussion. I know we'd have to sit down and have coffee to have a long dialogue, though, brother. Definitely, we'll let the next one go.
Professor West, in your opinion, what do you think the best way to address the problem of what you have outlined as the denial of white supremacy and it's being used as a mechanism? What is the best way to strategize against that as a black woman in America who has to deal with both racism and sexism? What can you give me by way of when people deny racism and I have to live with the reality of it, and when they deny gender discrimination, I have to live with the reality of that? Can you give me some tips on some strategies for me dealing with this so stress doesn't mount?
No, I'm with you, though. You start off by listening to a little John Coltrane to cool things out. Be empowered. But then after that, you have to be affiliated with some network, group of people, collectivity, or organization that's trying to highlight the denial and to bring power and pressure to bear. You must never feel as if you as a person are isolated, insulated, and unrelated to others who are going through the same thing, or fellow citizens of all colors who are concerned about what you're going through, who will also be part of these organizations and networks and so forth. But you have to be connected in some way. And of course, part of the problem, Marcus Garvey used to say this all the time on 137th Street in front of Liberty Hall in Harlem, the major problem facing black people is disorganization. We have to be better organized, more effectively organized, both for a black operational unity and for a multiracial alliance and coalition, so that we're able to push back on various fronts, these evils of white supremacy and male supremacy and wealth inequality and so forth. But organizing is very important. Now, what particular organizations you would want to pursue would be both a local matter in terms of here in Chicago, as well as a national one that you wrestle with in the depths of your own heart and so on. I don't like to proselytize in that way. But the crucial thing is keep your own sense of self going, possibility, dignity, grace, rage in your heart. Nothing wrong with rage as long as it doesn't degenerate into bitterness, and enough love in your soul to connect and relate to others who are constituting institutions and organizations. That, for me, is the crucial thing. Yes, Brother Vernon, legendary Vernon. How you doing there, man?
Dr. West.
We'll end with the last speaker in line because there's another commitment Dr. West has to go to.
Dr. West, I think it's quite clear to anybody who watches TV and who reads the newspapers that one of the strongest pillars of resistance to affirmative action and to the equal treatment using the instruments of the law for black people comes from organized white religion. They are quite open with it. The conservative wing of politics is bolstered by organized white religion. Now, this question: wouldn't you advocate that organized black religious leaders confront these people in the name of Jesus Christ?
In the name of Jesus. What kind of confrontation you have in mind?
And I think that's what our great author has said.
Yes,
that in the name of Christ, where can you justify being a right-wing conservative supporting Proposition 209 in California, including the Negroes who are at the lead of this? How can you do this in the name of Jesus Christ and just have a plain-out confrontation with the white religious leadership of this country? I'll sit down.
I appreciate the question. Appreciate the question. No, I mean, one is that we know that some of the most vicious and pernicious things imaginable have been done in the name of Jesus Christ. You know what I mean? Anti-Jewish hatred of Christian churches down through the years, dehumanizing women, gay brothers, lesbian sisters, so forth, so on and so forth. I think anytime we talk about organized religion, be it white, black, and so forth, we really have to use some language of prophetic wing, mainstream, and retrograde, just as heuristic categories. See what I mean? So that it always leaves open the possibility of some prophetic elements coming together, be it white, red, black, brown, or what have you, because you had to throw in the Negroes there, you right? And they just as retrograde, and you would think ought to be less so given the hell that they've gone through. But it's a question of what kind of moral choices and political commitments they have in light of their understanding of the gospel, and that's a human choice, as it were. And certainly those who are part of a prophetic wing, intellectually, politically, and so forth, confront, as you say, engage in dialogue, attempt to push, also themselves organize. But we cannot deny the larger context of American life. This is an icy moment, not just in America, but in transatlantic industrial societies. It's a right-wing tilt. We talked about the idols of the market that generate cold-hearted, mean-spirited, egoistic, hedonistic, narcissistic, individualistic modes of being in the world. And it cuts across color, cuts across class. And so the prophetic wings must be more vocal, more bold, more courageous, no doubt about that. They need to be more organized within the black community, within brown, within red, within yellow, within white, certainly so. And some of that is taking place. Professor Cohn has been leading that now for 30 years. It's just that they have not been successful in the way in which we like, because prophetic forces in general have not been as successful. The best of the trade union movement has not been as successful against managerial power. You see what I mean? So that it's a larger context with which we have to come to terms, but I resonate so much with your aims and ends, though. Yeah, go right ahead.
My question really focuses on what maybe could be termed a lack on the part of the traditional black church. I wanted to get your thoughts on recently the developments of what some people might characterize as a nouveau Christianity, the writings of Marianne Williamson, Scott Peck, et cetera, black authors who write similarly, and if the emergence in black, and people who would traditionally be a part or may be a part of the traditional black church, their willingness to turn in those kinds of writings, is that reflective of some lack on the part of the black church, or perhaps some needless searching on the part of the people who are looking that way?
No, I appreciate the question. Did everyone hear the question? Yeah, in the back. I appreciate the question. Well, one is that we certainly cannot deny that there's been a diversifying of choices among black people. There's no doubt about it, politically, socially, religiously, and so forth. And that's part and parcel of the black freedom movement. The black freedom movement in part is allowing people to choose freely. And sometimes those choices are good, sometimes they're bad, but it's just expanding the scope of those choices. And therefore you get more and more black people choosing a lot of different things that heretofore they did not choose, including different kinds of versions of Christianity and so on. Now we know that American civilization, in part, has been a grand experiment in articulating the modalities and possibilities of Christianity. Just in part, though. Mormons to different kinds of Baptists, you know. I mean, you remember the wonderful text in 1925 by Bruce Barton called The Jesus Nobody Knows? It was a bestseller for 2 years about Jesus as the best example of the modern advertising businessman with an executive committee of 12. Thoroughly American. And so you end up with a whole cult. And you think of all the other prophetic cults and so forth and so on. This civilization probably has more garden variety messiahs every generation than any other country in the world. Why? Because of these deep roots. Now, it's not a Christian nation because we got Jewish brothers and sisters and Buddhist brothers and sisters and atheists and secular Latitudinarians and agnostics and so forth and so on. And God bless them. We're glad they're fellow citizens. But what is it now? 72% of American people believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's a lot of Americans. And you're going to get a whole host of interpretations of Jesus Christ. It's unbelievable. No other nation has that kind of varieties of Christian experiences as it. What is it now? 2/3 of Americans believe not only there is a heaven, but they're going. Now that's optimism of the cheapest sort. Very American. Very American. 4% believe not only in hell, that they're going and maybe. What kind of theology is that? It's a post-resurrection Jesus theology, as Harold Bloom points out. It's not a Jesus of the cross wrestling with evil. It's a Jesus who delivers. Just like the market at the mall, it delivers for comfort and convenience and contentment. And yet the gospel is about dissatisfaction. It's about suffering. It's about how we're going to keep on, very much like those three sisters in Chekhov's great classic of January 1901. If only we knew, but we must go on. We can't go on. We will go on. We must live. We can't live. We will live. That's the real depth of struggle, it seems to me. That's what cuts against the grain in American religiosity in so many of its dominant forms, you see. And so I do think that in these nouveau Christianities, we have to use the same criteria of whether it accents the suffering, the shuddering, the struggling, and so forth. And again, we'll cut across not just racial lines, but even theological lines in this regard. But what I'm saying in part is that this has been very American, and it more than likely will continue. Thanks so much. I know we're coming to an end here. How you doing today?
Hi. Professor West, I enjoyed your lecture very much, and I was taking notes, and I think you answered my question, and I didn't quite get it. But what I want to know is, you mentioned something about the percentage and the wealth that Black American Africans was 30 years ago compared to today. What is it? Especially the wealth.
Right, wealth versus income being two very different things. There's no doubt that black people today are on the whole much wealthier than they were 30 years ago. But relative to their white counterparts, you see, the gap still remains large. When I use the term lumpen bourgeoisie, the black middle class beneath the white middle class, both in terms of income, but especially in terms of wealth. And this is results in part because, of course, historically, the black middle class gained access to middle class positions through government, through federal government, through state jobs, through city jobs, you see. And of course, most of the wealth in the capitalist society is in the private sphere, where there's hardly a cap on salaries if you can take off, as it were. The black middle class remains caught. Was it now something like 48% of the black middle class still locked into public sphere jobs, which means that they don't make that much money, even though they're able to live much better than their parents or grandparents did for the most part. So again, relative progress vis-a-vis the situation of black people in 1969 and 1998, but at the same time, the gap still remains in terms of where the vast numbers of black people are vis-a-vis their white fellow citizens. So that's what I had in mind, in part, in terms of this thing. Yeah. Thank you so very much.
Dr. West, Kwame Porter. In Dr. Cohn's book on Malcolm Martin, Dream or Nightmare, he, as well as Dr. Wilmore yesterday, and there are two new texts out that seem to say that what we lack at this point, at the leadership level, are leaders like Malcolm or Martin, Garvey, who can sustain masses in terms of their hope. And so the question is being raised in a couple of new texts on whether the current leadership has not been co-opted to the degree that we are without the mass leaders, but the masses can sustain a kind of a hope, masses being black, white, or brown, who strive for liberation. And you've addressed that, of course, in some of your texts. But Dr. Wilmore yesterday addressed that, and I think I'm quoting correctly. He's back at it. He said that we do not have the prospects, I hope I'm correct, of a mass-based leader who can sustain the hope of the masses. Jim indicates that in his book on Malcolm Martin.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, though, and it's a very difficult question because, of course, one can never imitate the past. Imitation is suicide, Emerson says, and he's right about that. We can learn from the past. We can be inspired and instructed by the past, but we never can go back. I don't believe there will ever be the kind of mass leader that Marcus Garvey was, because he was responding to uprooted peasant black folk wrestling with Jim Crow into the cities with tremendous expectations and running up against walls with riots in the summers of 1917, 18, and 19, so disillusioned that they were willing to even contemplate leaving the country. That was a particular historical moment. He seized that moment and became a mass leader. Martin Luther King Jr., building on the richness of a Southern church culture in which the masses of black folk were still rooted in the South, who had migrated in the 40s and 50s, but the movement begins in 1955 and 1956. You see. And by the time Malcolm gets here in Chicago, with all of the xenophobia, which is just a fancy word for hating black folk and brown folk and red folk and other folk who have been viewed as other, that Brother Martin encountered in Chicago and Los Angeles and New York, it was clear that the same strategies in the South were going to be problematic in other parts of the country. So in that sense, there'll never be another Martin, even though we learned from Brother Martin. We love him so. There'll never be another Malcolm, partly because there'll never be another Elijah, and there's no Malcolm without Elijah, even though he breaks. How do we build on their examples given the new circumstances and conditions? That, for me, is the challenging question. And I think the first thing we need to do is to try to create context in which we can attempt to be truthful with one another about the relative failure of those who now pose as the sole major exemplary primary leaders and spokespersons, not in the spirit of revenge or put down, but simply to get them to be truthful about themselves. One of the reasons why Harold Washington was one of the greatest progressive mayors that this country's ever produced here in Chicago is not primarily a matter of skin pigmentation, but he had a certain vision, courage, character, and he knew that he had to deal with corporate Chicago, the permanent government, always already there as mayors come and go. And he could deal with them in part not by relying on the apparatus of the Democratic Party solely, but organizing and mobilizing from outside so that he could have some pressure brought to bear on the system as a whole in light of the internal opposition at the council as well as corporate Chicago. And of course, as a Democrat, he knew you had to negotiate this kind of thing, because that's how we proceed through law and so forth at our best. At our best. Can we produce not just the new kinds of Harold Washingtons, but can we produce forms of leadership, political, social, artistic, athletic, art, academic, all of these forms of leadership, so very important, trying to coordinate and coagulate in such a way that we can maybe make a blow for justice and leave a trace of justice. But for me, fundamentally, we've got to talk about the raw stuff. You see, and that's courage to tell the truth, courage to love, courage to fight for justice. And we're living at a moment now, of course, where market forces are eroding the systems of caring and nurturing to such a degree that it's hard to even see the very sources for that courage. You see, because neglected love usually generates a cowardliness. Neglected love generates a gangster mentality. And the gangster mentality is a cowardly mentality. Obsessed with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. And that's a pervasive ethic in market-driven, fast-paced capitalist America. In every institution, every sphere, you see. So where does the courage reside? Younger generation, I have great hope. Not Generation X, but Generation Expectation. But the question is whether they'll be prepared enough, not simply to build on the courage, but also to broaden their vision and have that deep sense of history that is being erased daily by the market-driven mass media, the obsession with self-indulgent pleasure, the preoccupation of the moment, and so forth and so on. Sorry to go on so long, no, brother, but that's just the beginnings of an answer to your tough question. Last point, I think, is this, though, that if there's anything we learned from those leaders who came before, it is that we do not look for a leader. We are the leaders we've been looking for. What can we do? Each one personally. That's a democratic ethos. No messianic models, as it were.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we got one more question. Is it? We got time, nobody? Because I definitely. How you doing today?
I'm a senior citizen, and the thing that I get out of your book called Race Matters is that black and America are the real American heroes. Now, shouldn't we celebrate that? That's what I get out of your book.
No, you on track, though, brother. They're human heroes, which means that we have flaws and so forth, but certainly human heroes. Yeah.
Now, all this business about affirmative action and so forth and where we should stand, we have to celebrate ourselves that we are the real American heroes. Look at the slave ships. Look at all of the mayors that we have in various cities. See how far we've come, and you can only say that we are the real American heroes. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that point, though, brother. I mean, certainly is the case that there's so many unsung heroes who've given so much and loved and cared for us so much, the mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers. I do think that it does cut across race, but there's no doubt that when it comes to the unsung ones who are often downplayed, ignored, and overlooked, you find a whole lot of black folk in line as candidates for that kind of heroic energy, shot through with compassion, no doubt, no doubt. But I know it's time to go. Thanks so much.